Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is brought to you by, well, you. If you want to learn how to support our show, go to patreon.com/laststandmedia. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to Sacred Symbols Plus, a PlayStation podcast supplement. This is episode number 125 in this run. My name is Colin Moriarty. I'm joined today by our precious and most favorite lawyer, Last Stand Media's legal consultant, and just an overall great guy in his orange-red background, which I am very smitten with. Rick Hoeg. Rick, how are you today, my friend?
I'm doing great, Colin. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, I love my back wall, right? No,
Yeah,
it's
I
a
really
nice
do.
calming red.
Yeah, I know I've said it many times, but there's something very alluring about that color to me. I like things that trend towards orange. I must be
Hey,
honest.
all right.
It's a nice color and an underrated color, I think. But Mr. Hoeg, today I wanted to have you on the show. I thought it would be a timely thing. First of all, you and I had a funny interaction on Twitter because we were talking about mergers, or I had said something about mergers and acquisitions and how I feel like it's bad for creativity. You made
Right.
the counter argument, or said you could make the counter argument, and I thought that was serendipitous because I was about to reach out to you the next day. I was talking to Micah about it. I'm like, it would be nice to have Rick on to just talk about how mergers and acquisitions even work.
Sure.
People just bandy these things around, I think, without even having a working knowledge of how easy or difficult a process like that might be. And then this other thing can just be a nice little dovetail with the topic at hand, which is if it's good or
Absolutely.
not. Yeah.
We
So
could talk about what they are. We could talk about how they work and whether or not we should like them or not. Absolutely.
right, exactly. And of course, for people that are unaware, I think most of you listening know full well, but there's a round of corporate consolidation going on in the industry right now, and in many industries, in many parallel entertainment industries, certainly. And it's brought up a lot of who's going to buy who can acquire who. I think Microsoft buying Bethesda really set a new standard, or a possible standard, for how large these acquisitions can be. Of course, Sony's acquisitions are typically much smaller. Bluepoint, most recently, Nix's, etc. These are tiny compared to something like that. But Rick, I wanted to ask you at the very top, is the conversation around this in the industry a little too loose? Because it seems to me to be a little too loose. And what I mean by that is people are just like, Microsoft can just go to Take-Two and buy them. And I'm like, but wouldn't they have to like go to the stockholders and offer them money for their shares, or hostily take the company over, which is possible as well. So I saw different routes forward, and I just feel like people kind of talk about this without really realizing the massive lift behind the scenes to make something like this happen, and how many people have to be literally sold on this. It's not just like you go to Take-Two with money and they're like, yeah, of course we want that. They'll squeeze you for all you're worth, or tell you to go, kick rocks. So anyway, how do you find the tenor of the conversation about this in the industry right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think to me, you just follow it. I'm a fan. I do contracts, obviously, in gaming, and I have clients that are involved in gaming, but I'm a fan of the industry first and foremost. And I think people that are fans of the industry tend to talk about this issue almost like fantasy sports, fantasy baseball team, fantasy football team. Oh, wouldn't it be cool if this running back were in Microsoft's team, or this quarterback were on Sony's team? So I think you get into that same kind of lunchroom chatter. Man, what would it be like if Take-Two were purchased by Microsoft? And et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of fun. I mean, there's nothing wrong in my mind having the who could win in a fight, Superman versus Batman type talk with Microsoft and Sony. It obviously goes too far in social media, and people get too invested in these companies that are just trying to sell you a product.
Yeah, it's weird.
But I don't mind the fun of the thing. But what I do try to do on my channel and on yours and elsewhere is to explain the process and the procedure, and just simple things like when Microsoft announces they're buying Bethesda, you've gone through months of due diligence and negotiation to get to that point. But in the fall of last year, that's not a purchase. That hasn't happened yet. You sign, in that case, a merger agreement with a number of other conditions that have to happen after the fact, because it's going to take time and money to get those conditions done. And you want to make sure both sides are married before that happens. Once they're married, you can announce that to the world. But journalistic outlets, people conversing on these topics, they tend to skip right ahead to, oh, it was purchased. What should Microsoft do with Bethesda now? And I said, look, a lot of the times it's going to be a fait accompli. It's going to happen, but it's going to be months later. And we saw that happen last year. I think it was announced in September or so. It gets actually finalized in something like February of this year. And so it takes a while. All of these steps are a process. And you're absolutely right in your introduction to say, much like most transactions, yes, there's hostile takeovers. We can talk about those, but they're really rare because they're expensive and hostile. It takes two to tango. If you want to buy that house that you really love at the end of your block, chances are you're not going to be able to pull that off unless the person that owns that house is willing to sell it to you. And so even if you love something, you're going to have to convince them. Now, can you convince the person with the house if you over purchase it by $1 million? Maybe you can. There's a lot of things you can do with money. And I think that's how people come to the Microsoft conversation. It says, look at the resources of that entity. They can convince anybody to come. But not everybody's motivated by money. And we could talk about instances of that. One of my favorite, of course, is Insomniac's long burgeoning relationship with PlayStation. They could have been bought years ago, but they didn't want to be. They wanted to be independent. They liked that. And at some point they decided they didn't. And then that sale was made. And it was made, in my opinion, for pennies on the dollar. Insomniac
Definitely.
is by far the best ROI that I can imagine in the last 10 years of these deals.
Oh my God, certainly. Very well said on that front. And yeah, I feel like, well, so I want to actually talk about the hostile acquisitions first, because
Yeah,
the
of course.
only example I can think of in the industry, you can correct me if I'm wrong, was that Ubisoft was under threat from Vivendi for years of a hostile
That's right.
takeover, as I recall. And they were really trying to stop that from happening. And you can also correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought I was reading about this recently. I didn't know about this. I'm sure the idea of the hostile takeover is as old as like mercantilism and whatnot, but but it's really the 70s and the 80s, right? When people started doing this, as far as I
Yeah.
understand, like right where people actually started organizing to like hostily take companies over. Talk to me a little bit about what people are probably a little foreign to this. So talk to me about what that is, where it comes from, and why it's not really something that happens very often.
Sure. So the standard operating procedure for a merger is like we were just talking about with that house on the end of the street. The owner of the house, or the one that you're going to talk to purchase it in corporate land, is the board of directors. The standard operating procedure is you convince the board of directors that it's something that makes sense, that it's in the best interest of the company. We can take it further. We can get your stockholders paid out, whatever it's going to be. We got this big sack of money. It makes sense for the board to take it under advisement, to negotiate it, to approve it. And then what happens is, as part of the corporate process, they recommend the adoption of this merger agreement or acquisition agreement to the shareholders. So the shareholders are still technically the owners of the company, but your point of contact, since especially in a public entity, you can't talk to the whole cap table of shareholders, is to go to the board, talk to the board. The board starts considering it, maybe signs a term sheet, does due diligence, does all these things, and then recommends it to the shareholders. Now, let's say you approach the board, you can't get the board on board. No pun intended. So the board doesn't want to recommend it to the shareholders. Well, if you're a public company, then those public owners of the company can be convinced to buy it anyway. That's a hostile takeover. The hostility is not to the shareholders, who are probably pretty stoked about getting a lot of money, or at least a lot of them are, but to the board of directors. So the company itself, in the stead of the board, is not approving or recommending whatever is the proposed transaction. So, for instance, in Vivendi and Ubisoft, what happens is there are disclosure requirements when you get up to a certain ownership percentage of the company. So you can go buy stock on the public market. You can just keep increasing your percentage, increase your percentage, increase your percentage. And then when you get to some big milestones, and they vary by jurisdiction and by stock rules, but like 5% is a big one. You usually have to tell them that you exist. And then 20%, a whole bunch of stuff kicks in. So Vivendi was trying to get up or getting close to those numbers. Ubisoft was aware of them and trying to dissuade its stockholders. This isn't a good idea. We're going to make the most money. They're going to do some bad things. Look at their history, whatever it might be. And ultimately won that. Ultimately, Vivendi gave up. And I think
Yeah,
Ubisoft bought them out, or they sold back into the
they
market,
got
whatever that
they got
was.
I was reading they got up to 27.3% before they tapped out, which is pretty impressive. And
That's a lot for a public
yeah,
company. That's a lot of money and a lot of resources.
right, because I remember writing about it at IGN and writing stories every few months where it's like, now it's 2%, now it's 4%, now it's like
Right.
6 or 8 or whatever it was, because Vivendi was being total, as you said, because they had to disclose it, so they were actually being quite brazen with it.
Yeah, once
And
you're past that first disclosure threshold, so what you might not know is you've got a lot of companies that are thinking about potentially making a move or trying to make themselves attractive at the 4.9% of the world, or whatever that percentage is, where you're just inside the shadows. And then usually if you're going to make that move, you thrust forward. You go from 4.9 to 15 or whatever it is, because now you're going to have to say what you're doing anyway. The board's going to be cognizant of it. And yeah, what happens in a hostile takeover is you say, screw the board. I'm going to offer money to the shareholders. And if I get enough, then I'm in control of the company. Then I replace the board and we have a new conversation.
Right.
And that's how that works. And you still have to abide by any number of regulations, either in the United States or in France or wherever you might be purchasing a company. But that's essentially what the difference is between a hostile and kind of a normal set of transactions. You look at Microsoft and Bethesda, it's clear that at some point before September of last year, Microsoft and Bethesda are approached one way or the other. They have conversations. They decide, hey, this might work. They sign a term sheet months before that final agreement is entered into. And then by the time you get to the fall of last year, they're ready to say what the terms of this deal are and put it to the shareholders for approval. And much like Congress or something like that, the board has probably already whipped around and made sure that the shareholders are going to approve this. In the case of Bethesda or ZeniMax, I think they had enough ownership in the management group to basically make it a fait accompli once they had approved the deal terms. I can't be certain of that, but in general, you have that issue where you've got management or founders or whomever that can move even a public company with just their ownership.
I love the term of the use fait accompli, by the way. For people that don't know what that means, it basically just means like the foregone conclusion at that point.
See, I need people out there saying, what does pecuniary mean? Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's all good. I try to be more cognizant of that just so that people are not. So all right. So that solves, I think, the smaller thing, which is the hostile takeover, which is really romantic and fun. And,
oh yeah, for those of you that
like
don't
Succession
know
or whatever.
Succession, absolutely. There's an old HBO movie that I absolutely loved, which has some, inappropriate material. So, watch out for that, kids. But it's called Barbarians at the Gate, which is about the RJR Nabisco takeover and the hedge fund bidding process. Some really popular actors, might be early 90s. You should definitely check that out if you can find it anywhere, because it's awesome. And it's based on a book if you're interested in it as well.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, I love let's call it financial drama. I don't know if that's an actual genre, but
it was very dramatic. Hidden auctions, backstabbing bids, good stuff.
Yeah, it's awesome. And that's why I only watched the first season, but that HBO show Succession was really riveting to me because of that. But I have to get back to that at some point. All right. So that solves that. And hostile takeovers pretty much only make sense for public companies with lots of shares around. So obviously now we're talking about, right? I mean, can you hostily take over a privately held company? Because don't you have, I mean, it was in my agreements anyway with the companies I've owned where like I wasn't allowed to sell without like some
so
sort of.
So you're not allowed to sell when you have an illiquid stock because of securities regulations.
Right.
But in terms of business strategy, you can still sell your stuff. So we don't really call it, or at least I don't call it, a hostile takeover when you're talking about a closely held corp. Let's call it a cap table of 10 people. But if you go and you convince the founder, for instance, that, the CEO isn't doing his job and the board has flipped against you, and if you give me your 54%, we're going to make this right and we're going to flip everything around. That happens all the time. That kind of drama between founders and investors, it happens all the time. And that's one of the reasons why we try to get the documents right at the start, is so that everybody at least knows what their rights and obligations are, because people get frustrated at each other. There's differences in opinion of how a company should move. And so, yeah, if you've got the money, let's say you're a venture capital firm, you've got a big chunk of Series A, and there's 3 founders, and you can convince 2 of them to come with you and ostracize one of the founders, that might well happen, and you take over the board. So it's not really a hostile takeover. It's just more of a control thing.
Right.
But it's the same kind of concept.
Yeah, it's interesting. And yeah, I not about the hostile takeover part, but obviously, yeah, I know all about difference of opinions with people that you own something with and how messy that can be. So definitely solve that with a good lawyer at the very beginning, like Rick. So
well, that's the best way, definitely.
Yeah, certainly. Save yourselves a lot of problems later on. So, all right. So we have that kind of small interest aside, and now we're really talking about acquisitions and mergers to a degree. And it seems like Microsoft's purchase of ZeniMax and Bethesda was more of a Embracer-like purchase, where they are leaving them alone and keeping them in their own silo, at least for the time being. So very much like Embracer acquired Saber and Deep Silver and all the THQ Nordic and all of those things are in their own silos. But certainly this is the biggest acquisition in gaming history, right? To date.
I think it's just shy of one of the mobile acquisitions, but as we think about it, yes, I think there was a $9 billion acquisition.
Yeah, in real.
I would never use such a term as real. My wife is on level 3,000 of Dr. Mario or something on the iPhone. So,
well, good for her. Great game. Well, Dr. Mario is. I didn't play the mobile version, but I always loved Dr. Mario. Now, let's talk a little bit about and obviously we're talking hypothetically. I think Microsoft has been pretty, low key about the Bethesda acquisition, all things considered. I'd like a little bit more storytelling. Uh, and I know that they have their little weird little podcast and shit they do. That's not what I mean. I need someone to like write a book about this or something and tell us that what actually happened. And maybe one day that will occur. Although we have a dearth of journalists in the industry, so who knows if anyone would be interested. But fly on the wall, what do you think that situation was like? Illustrate to the audience how something like this might occur, because I think that there's some confusion about how does Microsoft go to ZeniMax and be like, here's an enormous amount of money, basically constitutes quarterly profits for Microsoft for one quarter, which is a small amount of money, but a large amount of money. And you go to them and you say, we want you, and it's going to come with a lot of money, but a lot of you're gonna have to cut off everyone else and all of these kinds of things. And it's a very complicated situation that I imagine takes many months and lots of travel and massaging and phone calls and second guessing and fear. So talk to me a little bit about how it might have gone.
Yeah, well, I mean, just like a marriage, it's that same kind of concept. You're changing your life in some fundamental way. So you get a lot of those conversations, even if with these big giant corps. I think with respect to ZeniMax, and this is all to some extent speculation because, as you say, they haven't been too forthcoming with the genesis of this. You had a situation where you had founders and ownership that I think was trying to move on in some important ways. I think you had the passing of one of the major founders of ZeniMax happen either after the announcement or shortly before it. And I think that's reflective of what was likely the mindset. So it wouldn't surprise me if ZeniMax contacted Microsoft on this. But I will say, before we get into the specifics of Bethesda and ZeniMax, when you think about corporations buying each other, understand that for the most part, they're always on the phone. There are people whose jobs are only to kind of business develop, pay attention to what everybody else is doing, have friendly conversations, say, hey, if you're ever thinking about selling, don't forget, we're in the business of acquiring folks. We've got, in my case, with some of the big folks in my neck of the woods, you've got folks with venture capital funds that say, hey, if we want to do a strategic acquisition, let us know. And we'll see if you're a good fit, that kind of thing. And much like a sports team or someone else that's engaged in changing assets, you're on the phone all the time. And 90% of those are, okay, fine, great. Yes, we'll tell you if we're ever selling our company, but not
Right.
anytime soon. But you
Right.
keep all those things in motion. So at some point, ZeniMax has worked with Microsoft, says, hey, we have a pretty long relationship. We see you're buying companies. Maybe we're not in the business of selling, but maybe you take us to a nice lunch or a nice dinner. We have the conversation. Say, I could see myself doing something else. And then you get the window open a crack. And then you start having more fulsome conversations. And all these things come from relationships. The one thing I like to tell folks is to remember that even the Microsofts of the world, right? Whatever $1 trillion market cap you see next to these, they're still human beings. They're still people talking to people about these questions. So you are having the conversation with ZeniMax and say, well, what would this look like? Okay, we could do this amount in cash. This would be stock. It would be a merger. What would the tax implications be? You go down the road of what it would look like. And then you get to those emotional questions. What does it mean for me, who's made my livelihood running this company, to now be a Microsoft company? Am I going to be promised certain amounts of independence? What is it? What do you think you're going to do with this, Microsoft, after we sell it to you? And you get to arrangements like what you see right now. You likened it to Embracer. I like to liken it to Disney, because I think people can understand Marvel is not Disney, even though it definitely is, right? So Disney owns all of that, but lets Kevin Feige do whatever the heck he wants, by all appearances. And so it's easy to understand that right now Microsoft's telling a story where they're going to leave Bethesda be, because Bethesda's been pretty successful selling stuff. Whether or not that holds is going to depend on a lot of things: how successful they are, how good the integration is, how good the reporting is. They haven't had to report to upper management at a giant multinational global conglomerate before, right? That's going to be a bit of a culture shock to
And
somebody there.
and also people that, and it's fair to say that people that are in situations with options and all these things where they're getting paid out for this typically have to stay, right? I mean, because they want the talent to stay, right? So they also have to vest themselves for years into this company that they won't necessarily control anymore, right? Isn't that the danger
It
of doing
really,
it?
really depends.
Yeah,
So I would say that an acquisition, and we're talking about mergers, we're also talking about acquisitions.
sure.
There's a reason M&A go together. But an acquisition like this is going to, in all likelihood, identify what they see as key employees and figures that are very important to them. And they're going to, depending on whether they're using more of a carrot or more of a stick, they're going to incentivize those people to stay. A lot of the time when you're coming in and you're buying a company like this, you're going to try to incentivize them positively. Hey, we're going to pay out some of your options as you sell because, hey, we're buying the whole company. And then we're going to give you more in Microsoft. But it's going to vest over 4 years, or it's going to vest over 5 years, or a milestone that you have to deliver. And so we want you to stay with. You can also use more ordinary income kind of means. You can use a retention bonus. Hey, if you stay with us for at least 18 months, you're going to get a big chunk of change, right? And you see this in smaller acquisitions than Microsoft and Bethesda. If you pay attention to the dates, and maybe you notice this in other podcasts and things that got purchased by large venture capital firms, you can see when people leave, and if they leave together, and if they leave together after, I don't know, a 6-month anniversary of that sale, you can start to go, okay, the incentives probably lined up in such a fashion where it made sense for them to stay for X amount of days, but I'm not really going to stay. And that happens a lot. That's to be expected in these kinds of transactions. Somebody at ZeniMax, somebody at Microsoft was made redundant and isn't feeling terribly comfortable about their situation. And that's unfortunate, but that's the way these things work. You take two companies, you make them one. That's how this happens. So yes, they're going to incentivize people and potentially punish others, but it's fairly normal course. And while it makes everybody a little bit uncomfortable because you're changing something about the way you run your life, a lot of the times it can work out if you've got companies that are used to doing this kind of thing. And if anybody is used to buying companies, it's Microsoft. This is not their first rodeo at all.
Right. And I was thinking about that as well, because part of me was thinking that just the sheer difficulty of merging cultures and operations and all of that, I assume there are entities out there that are more conservative that are dissuaded from doing that at all because it's so complicated. And Microsoft seems to be one of those companies that just doesn't care at all about doing that.
I think more than they don't care, they probably have just gotten used to the risks and gotten used to the feeling. And okay, you go in, you do your due diligence, you say, ZeniMax, what are you doing with your accounting of this subsidiary? This is super weird. And they go, all right, we'll figure it out as we go along. Versus another company that maybe doesn't buy as many as Microsoft or someone else would look at one of those due diligence issues and say, oh, nope, we're good. Because there's any number of landmines and potholes that can pop up that can dissuade you. And so you do see in Microsoft a culture that says, we want to put these dollars to good use. We're not happy with how they might otherwise be spent. We're going to do it buying video game companies. And they're clearly still in the business of doing that.
What about small, like, we're dealing with Bethesda, big entity, publisher, owns its own developers, all of that.
Yeah.
What about the individual developers? We've seen, these smaller entities. I know that the process is probably procedurally the same, but how do you think the Housemarques and the Blue Points and the Nixes, these smaller companies, 70 headcount, 50 headcount, how does that conversation go? Or I can imagine, in my mind's eye, I kind of feel like that could be a conversation started by either side in those
Absolutely.
situations. Yeah.
Absolutely. It wouldn't surprise me if the business model for some of those companies, and I don't know any of those particularly, but some of them are going to be built to be acquired. That you're going to be doing this to say, hey, we're going to make ourselves so sexy that it's going to make sense for somebody to come swoop in and get us. And that's part of the conversation we'll have about mergers and acquisitions and innovation. But I think when you're north of even maybe 20 employees, you're getting into the range where it's probably not going to feel substantially different than ZeniMax, if you can believe it. You get to a certain amount of complexity where you've got employees, you've got back office support, you've got payroll, you've got ERISA plans, whatever it might be, where you're dealing with the same kind of stuff. Yes, there's a lot more of it in ZeniMax and Bethesda, but you're dealing with the same kind of questions. To me, where you get into really interesting questions, if you look at like the acquisition of Night School Studio by Netflix this last week, which is like a handful of people, then you got a whole lot of other issues. And one of the things I often tell clients is when you're dealing with founders, when you're dealing with really small companies that are their baby, you have a whole different kind of layer on negotiations, right? At the end of the day, ZeniMax, public company, probably still thinking about things as money, dollars in, dollars out, ROI, etc. When you start talking to people about exiting, selling their company, especially to like a multinational company like Netflix, and it's their baby, you're adding a whole level of emotionality to it. I mean, I've been on calls about a merger and assignment agreement that wound up with somebody crying, like just sobbing. And you have to be cognizant of that because you built this thing. I mean, people really feel things for the companies they build.
Hmm.
And that's part of that conversation. Is that Nix's? Is that Blue Point? I don't know them well enough, but they're big enough where you're probably at least one round away from just founders in the room, just that kind of conversation. And so that's going to add a little extra. Professionalism's the wrong word, but at least a little extra non-emotionality to these kinds of conversations. And there is nothing wrong with that. And that's part of, heck, that's part of the service I provide. I do exits for companies of businesses that have been run for like 35 years, and they're walking away. Yeah, they're getting my time money. They're going to an island somewhere, but it's hard. And knowing that and having that conversation is part of that. So there's so much that goes into these things. That's why you have lawyers, and I'm more of a generalist than just an M&A guy, but that just do this. That's all they do for their entire career.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, I felt very emotional selling my part of Kind of Funny because I owned
I
it.
would
I
believe it.
founded it, and it was a piece of me will always be in it, but it was me like literally relinquishing my right to it, and I own all of this, and um, I've really been tried to be cognizant with Lilymo, the other company I own, as you know, the developer. I own a minority share of it, and respecting the entire time that I didn't found it, that it's not my company. Like I think Barry, the other owner, would tell you that like I go above and beyond. I'm like everything's. I don't. It's totally yours. It's named after your dog. Like so all that. So there's got to be a little bit of respect too. And I'm always interested. I mean, this is just me throwing this out here for no reason, but I'm always interested in the tenor of these as far as like the kindness or the hostility or whatever it might be, where people are eager or understanding or I don't know. There's
Well,
so
I'll tell
that's
you this.
yeah, please.
We've canceled a deal, $50 million deal, when 11th hour somebody said something to the founder. We were the target in this particular instance. They didn't like. We had a midnight meeting kind of conversation with them where we said, "Well, look, if they're treating you this way now, how do you feel about your assets going to this company? You're supposed to have a 2-year transition agreement with them." And ultimately, they decided, we think the clause came out a little early, but they're actually not who I thought they were. Walked away from $50 million. And as it turned out, they bought a different company, did some bad things with them. And my client wound up very happy with that. But you get into those kinds of conversations until that dotted line is signed. You can walk away and you could potentially get sued. There are a lot of lawsuits about good faith, fair dealing, whether or not you're allowed to terminate in those kinds of circumstances. But I remember the emotionality of a very late night conversation because the other side tried to sneak in a provision and some other things at the very last minute and said, no, these aren't the kind of people I want to work with, and walked away.
Yeah, and that's good to hear because like God, it's so high stakes. I love it. It's so high stakes, and I think that's where the tears and all that. I mean, how could you not be ultimately emotional about that?
Yep.
Now, I wanted to talk to you about this other side of things because I know you have a heart out today. I want to respect that. And I definitely want to pick your brain about this because I think a lot of people have been really pleasantly surprised to find that you are a great analyst of video games. People I think have
It's very
often, you know
nice
what I
of
mean?
them to say.
Well, it's funny, we did Returnal together and we had the review discussion about that and we had a really great convo and people really enjoyed that and are always asking for your opinions and I was very pleased that we could merge the two ideas that I had. Well, the idea you had for a podcast and the idea I had for a podcast into this. And now here is my thesis. And I know
Okay.
that you disagree with it. Um, Now this is general. I'm not saying that this certainly can't be true all the time, but my assumption would be that in purchasing a company, you are worried about getting returns on that company and maybe facilitating that as quickly as possible to make you as comfortable as possible. And thus, I feel like the consolidation round that the industry is experiencing right now is profoundly negative. People really expect me to be like rah rah Sony and all of that. And I'm like, well, I'm not. I think that Fire Sprite was a little weird, but certainly Blue Point and Housemark makes sense. And as I said on Twitter, I think all rational pieces are off the board now. And um, I'm not one of these guys that thinks they should go around and buy these companies. I think it's just not good. But you disagree, and I'm at least partially, and I'm curious what your angle is on how M&A can be good for our industry because I really worry about having everything in the control of 8 or 10 companies, which is what's happening. I mean, Jesus Christ, we just talked about Netflix. It's like now we have to worry about these guys.
Oh
and
yeah, I did a video on Netflix and Amazon. They had successful days this week, and
and I
that's an
was
interesting
yeah.
inflection point.
And I was, by the way, I must say, I said it on Sacred, the regular episode too. I'm thrilled for Amazon because first of all, I know people there and I like them, but also they've worked really hard to do something and they've just really fumbled. And so I was happy for them. But man, we almost don't think about some of these companies that are getting involved. And I'm fearful for it. I love the Focus Home Interactives and that new Kepler Interactive that was announced this week, which is like the 7 indie studios kind of combining. I'm worried more about, people rah-rahing about, yeah, Microsoft buy Take-Two. I'm like, why the hell do you want that? I own Microsoft stock and I don't want that. So anyway, go on.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think disagree from my perspective is a little strong, but I would say that I think
Hmm.
there are perspectives that are missed. So I think that the perspective that is missed, and this happens when we're having conversations on my channel, like Epic versus Apple and things along those lines, is this notion that everything is, I'm going to use Latin, so I apologize in advance, ceteris paribus, which is that everything else is going to maintain the exact same status as it had before whatever it is that we're talking about. So Microsoft buys up all these companies, Sony buys up all these companies, and then nothing ever happens. There's just two silos of companies that have all these things. And yeah, that's bad. I can agree with the notion that more leaders doing more different things is great. But what I will say is, if you're talking about an industry that's actively having mergers and acquisitions, that has power players, whether that includes Amazon and Netflix and Google and everyone else or not, if it's just Microsoft, Sony, and whomever, if you've got people that are throwing around those resources, that is an environment where you are more likely to see more entrants into that market. Whether or not that's because they want to become Microsoft and Sony in the future, which is hard without the capital, or whether they want to get in there, innovate, do some wacky stuff, and get bought, it doesn't matter functionally for where that innovation comes from. So where you see a lot of acquisitions and a lot of mergers, if you think about this as something like pharmaceuticals, a much loved industry, the way they operate very often is to have what amounts to research and development startups. That these geniuses at some research university or institution are going to come up and they're going to figure out what's going to work, but they can't go through the FDA's trials, and so they're going to get bought by a big company, and it's essentially outsourced R&D. To my mind, if you've got a good environment, a good locus of mergers, acquisitions, capital, spending, willingness to spend and buy, you're going to have a lot more people engaged in doing wacky stuff to go and get bought. And so I think that it's easy to say it's bad for what we see. Okay, Double Fine's not selling everywhere because they're only on Microsoft. I made a video about Netflix purchasing Night School where I said editorially, I wasn't thrilled because I don't tend to like Netflix's narrative output. I really like what Night School has put out. And now it seems like I'm going to have to get a Netflix subscription to go get their stuff. That sucks, right? I can get behind that as being something that people don't like.
Sure.
But if it means that the next Night School starts because we're in a more advanced marketplace, an industry that's willing to spend money on things, that's willing to look at them, I'm all for it. So it's really a matter of kind of a second order function. What is the change in state of the marketplace and the economy based on allowing these things, based on them happening? And in general, I have been absolutely 100% in favor of seeing Microsoft, the mighty gorilla that was threatened in 2000, finally say, oh, hell yeah, I guess we'll throw our money at it. And that essentially requiring everybody else to join the arms race, to evaluate things, to figure out how their businesses work, I think overall is good for organization and ultimately good for innovation, even if within the silos and the big companies, you might see a more conservative approach.
Yeah, it's a very compelling argument, I think, actually, because you're right. This is a Cold War. No one really wants to fight it. I think Microsoft is kind of bringing everyone to the yard in a way and saying like, well, you're going to. And I think Nintendo's totally fine staying pat. They very, even with Pokemon and stuff, like they have all these weird deals with companies and second parties, and I think they're totally fine. I think Sony was feeling the heat internally a little bit this year, and I think that they've nicely steadied their ship. And I think you make a compelling argument that just inherently makes everyone worried, and so it brings their best foot forward. I think that's totally true. But I always wonder, and I guess this is a silly thing, really, but when you're a company as big as Microsoft,
Mm-hmm.
what the fuck do you want with these companies other than to just milk them, right? I mean, that's kind of my thing. I really refuse to believe Sony the same, by the way. But when Sony's just not going out and buying companies like Bethesda, so we don't have to have those conversations. There's just no equivalent conversation. But I look at it, I guess I'm just always skeptical. I'm like, why? What, it's not like, it's not a company putting everything on the line to buy Bethesda because they really believe in it. It's almost like an afterthought. And that to me is like gratuitous levels of capitalism in some sense. I know I'm a conservative capitalist in some I am, but I don't like this consolidation on top of consolidation on top of consolidation because it just locks people out. Eventually, the Keplers and the Focus Home Interactives and all of that are just going to become new. Those are going to become the targets, because now everyone, there's almost nothing for sale above that. And I don't know. I want these companies to remain loose, make new companies, make new ideas, maintain their culture and all of that. Do you think that there's any blatant negative to this trend towards merger or
I
acquisition?
do. I mean, I think you're getting into a situation where you're going to rely on fewer thought leaders to determine where more resources are allocated in the near term, right? So your question about, well, aren't they just going to milk it? Absolutely. Corporations can do that. In my opinion, those are corporations that aren't functioning very well. That if you're trying to maximize shareholder profits, as you're required to do under Delaware corporate law, et cetera, is you're supposed to be taking into account those long-term profits, how to actually make your product work longer to maximize the return for those folks. But yeah, can you get Activision selling you 14 Guitar Heroes in like a 2-year period or whatever it was? You absolutely can. But ideally, you don't. Ideally, you get a situation where Microsoft lets ZeniMax be siloed and do whatever they want, and they're mostly throwing resources at things. I think there is definitely, and I think Psychonauts 2 is my favorite example of this year, there is definitely a case to be made for wacky Tim Schafer and Double Fine finally just having money thrown at their ideas. And there's a polish and a clear resource investment in that game that definitely didn't exist at Double Fine before their acquisition. And so for those of you that think that Microsoft can be mostly hands off, but just use their resources like a rich kid with a
Yeah, like a
trust fund
bank.
and just start
Yeah.
throwing them at things, that could be advantageous. Again, in the near term. Long term, there's all sorts of questions about these things because, I've talked about Sony, and I know you've got the Sony podcast. You love Sony. I love Sony too, but I've had a problem with them for a couple of years now of seemingly turning most of their output into what I call over-the-shoulder third-person action adventure.
Yeah.
And
Sony
I
games.
love those. I love those, but I also love other things.
Right. Me too.
And I like variety, and I would love to see Sony do more of that variety. And you do worry if they keep, consolidating their power, we're going to get more of what they like and what they trust, and less of that kind of craziness. So yeah, I spend as much time playing indies as AAA at this point in time, but that doesn't bother me as much. And I do think you still have those incentives to have more indies because they're getting looked at more.
Yeah, it's what you say makes perfect sense, but
I'm
I
tricky
think it
that way.
requires everything to go just so. It's weird to romanticize this because it was tragic at the time and it sucked and it did actually set forward a whole new phase of gaming. But watching the original THQ evaporate because of one mistake is almost kind of romantic. Like, wow, they really fucked everything up because of one game. And I know that that's not like what you want, but it just showed a kind of scrappiness. Like these guys were one mistake away from losing the whole house, and they did. And I feel like decision making under that pressure cooker can either be catastrophic, you draw, or it could be something really amazing. And I guess that's just the romantic what if that I have in my mind, and why I'm really rooting for these smaller entities. And I'm quite attracted to the idea of Lilymo creating its own, well, we are publishing, but creating its own collective to kind of like buttress ourselves and maybe some others that we like away from
I get that.
Chinese
And
money, away from, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm not. I'm jumping on you. You don't have
Yeah.
to apologize to me. I totally get that, and I think that's kind of my point with respect to everything's not going to be ceteris paribus, right? You see things like the publisher of the 7 independent games coming together and making those. You see things on Steam with independent game alliances being sold as packages. You see folks coming together in ways to support what they're doing against some of the other stuff, and that's not going to stop. So I have always liked the dynamism of these kinds of markets. And yes, they can go badly. And hopefully, if they go badly, somehow the market, the consumer, someone else winds up whapping them on the nose. Microsoft starts abusing their position with all these different companies. They don't get the market share they want. Game Pass isn't as attractive. Bad things happen. Sony decides to only make AAA over the shoulder blockbusters. chances are I'm not going to invest as much in their future hardware. Now, I'm
Right.
not the only person in the market, but hopefully you have those kinds of corrective actions. And I do think while it's easy to say, oh man, those things are getting siloed off, we are in an increasingly independent environment where cool stuff is happening. And I don't think those should be separated. That the arms race, the acquisition, the market as it stands today is a part of the story of why we're seeing such independent growth and so much money being spent by so many people on betting their house, on going after the dream. And I agree with you. It might be romantic. I love that stuff as well. I think you already know this, but I was in Big Law, didn't like how I was pricing out a bunch of people, wanted to work with more entrepreneurs because I get the energy from my job from, my God, you're doing what? You've got a degree and you've got this crazy idea for a new, I don't know, lathe, and we're going to make it happen, and you're going to mortgage your house for a second time. And I like to help people doing that because to me, that's how the world gets better is you got those dreamers. But,
Absolutely. Very well said.
but I don't think acquisitions take away from that, even if they could. And hell, I make videos almost every month about Sony or Microsoft screwing up something I don't like and not thinking long-term enough. But I think it's a little bit excessively conservative to worry about that in the future when I think it's working out right now today.
Well, let's close out with like a couple of questions I want to ask you. These are all hypotheticals. We
Absolutely.
have to take out our crystal ball, put on our turban, and Jim. This is Jimmy Car. It's a Carson reference, by the way. I mean, that show is 30 years old now, so I don't ended. I'm sorry, 30 years ago. So I don't know if I should be making a
You're worried
Johnny
about your
Carson rather.
Karnak
By the way,
references?
yeah,
Yeah. Oh,
Karnak
I love
reference.
it.
Yeah, Johnny Carson. I don't know if I should be making a Johnny Carson reference, but all right. So let me ask you a few things.
Sure.
Actually, let me ask that second. Could Microsoft buy Take-Two? Could Microsoft buy Square Enix? Could these things happen? Conceivably.
Yes.
Do you think Microsoft will ratchet it up to buy a company with a market cap as big as some of these companies? Square Enix actually, I think, has a smaller market cap, but some of the companies that are being bandied around, such as Take-Two, EA, these are massive publishers. Do you think that will happen?
I don't think it's impossible. So I don't think it's impossible for them to do that. I think there are far more considerations than just the fantasy football of it all. Of wow, it would be cool if we had Final Fantasy, or if we could control Square Enix proper, or Take Two. If we could have exclusive Red Deads and Grand Theft Autos, wouldn't that be amazing? There's a lot more that goes into it. Whether that's people's willingness, the founders' willingness, what that price tag would be, actually bringing in the culture, whether or not you like the product, whether there's product overlap with your existing studios and people, all these kinds of things. But first and foremost, you're sitting within 12 months of a $9 billion deal. It's probably going to take a little bit longer for them to even kind of digest that meal that they had and work with them and make sure that this all works at that size. Now, if everything is gangbusters, Bethesda totally worked. It's making ROI hand over fist. They're selling millions and millions of game passes because of this. Then yeah, you start to get hungry again if you got Microsoft resources. And so you could start to look at it. But to me, that's not really near term. That's probably at least past Starfield and figuring out what that looks like for Game Pass increases and things like that, and then potentially jumping forward. And if that's the time frame, then you're not realistically looking at anything for a couple of years at minimum. But I've been wrong before, and Microsoft has been more aggressive than I would have thought they would have been, based on 20 years of history of kind of playing mostly light-handed in the video game industry. So I don't want to say never. And certainly the original question was, can they? Yeah. People underestimate how big Microsoft is because they're used to talking about Nintendo and Sony and everything else. Microsoft is orders of magnitude bigger than any player in this market because video gaming, for the most part, for the last 21 years, it has been a hobby for them, a side business. And they essentially control enterprise and are huge. So they could buy the whole thing. The regulators wouldn't let them. But if they wanted to, they could start directing those resources at other very large publishers.
Now, let me ask you as a gamer, I mean, this is kind of the question that a lot of people, I mean, I've certainly brought this up and it's controversial, but does Microsoft run the risk of pushing it too far? Not with the regulators, but with the audience, with the market. I have this kind of feeling in my mind that I feel like Bethesda was the furthest that they can push it without getting massive pushback. And I think mostly it's because Bethesda at that time had kind of been waning a little bit. Also, I think
Right.
that they have a heritage with Xbox, so it makes a little bit more sense there. But people going in like, yeah, now we're gonna go get Take-Two and all this, and I'm like, I just feel like they do that. I'm not saying this as a PlayStation first gamer. I'm saying this as just a rational observer. I feel like they do that at their own peril. I really do. Do you think that that's true or false?
I do. I think that you, at some point, whether it's this point or later on, are walking the line where you could become the evil empire. Where, okay, yeah, you brought over Starfield and Elder Scrolls, and that was important to a lot of different types of gamers. But as you say, we've got a history with Xbox, so it's okay. You steal Final Fantasy, you steal Grand Theft Auto, Red Dead Redemption with your big pot of money. I think you are going to start to have more ire about that and more agitation. Does it matter if the products continue to deliver? Probably not
Hmm.
in kind of the medium term, but I think it's something that you got to be cognizant of. And I say regulators, the regulators are going to care if you buy a second publisher within a couple of years. They're at least going to have a talk with you. And that's not to say that there isn't still a great deal of market participation in the gaming industry, but Microsoft is on that big tech list, is in the conversations about whether or not we should change all the antitrust laws and all these other kinds of things, which I have my own feelings on. But as one of those participants, they've got a closer eye on them right this second in the current regulatory environment than most. So you've got audience problems, you've got regulator problems. You're probably still digesting Bethesda. So I think people jumping on another huge, massive acquisition in the near term, in this year or early next, I think is probably too fast. But I don't know. Microsoft could go crazy.
And I guess I want to also ask you from as for a perspective on Sony. It seems unfathomable to me that they would make a move as big as Bethesda. I don't think they could even make a move as big as Take-Two without.
They're much smaller.
Right. Um, and I'm wondering if you could see Sony, based on their history of not doing this, do you see a reality where they start getting scared and they maybe start making massive moves to get bigger entities than they used to get? Because I feel like Firesprite was the first acquisition I think they've ever made, in my opinion, where I'm like, what?
You're
You know,
reaching.
like, because I was just like, I understand they made the persistence and stuff, but they're all by all accounts a good team, but there's no. I didn't look at them like I looked at Quantic or Supermassive or these others in the past, where I'm like, these are obvious targets. So do you think
Well, I think if
Sony
Sony
starts
could have
playing?
it back, they would have grabbed Ninja Theory. I mean, I think that's the one that looks to me as I say, how did that one slip through their fingers?
Right.
Uh, but no, I don't think Sony will match it. I think if you try to get into a real arms race, an actual honest to God spending money arms race with Microsoft, you've lost. Like it's over. Your strategy was wrong. So I think Sony's doing the right thing by saying, all right, what we're going to really do is we're going to focus on what I would call technical craft. The Nixes, the Blue Points, they're really focusing on just what appear to be excellent coders doing crazy good stuff with whatever's at their disposal and trying to win a quality battle. So they become the 5-star restaurant against the 1-star or the 3-star. People get mad at me when I say this stuff on my channel, by the way. I'm not trying to imply Microsoft is terrible. I'm just trying to say that Game Pass is clearly more of a buffet style
Right.
offering,
I agree.
and and,
I agree. Yeah.
and Sony's trying to figure out how to make the world's best steak and put it on your plate, because they know you can't go head to head. You can't just say, all right, we're just going to fight you with money. So no, I think they would very much avoid trying to escalate with them buying. I mean, who's most likely for Sony to buy in even that range? Square Enix.
Yeah,
I mean,
Square Enix,
the
I think would be a good.
JRPGs.
Yeah, and maybe Capcom or
So
something. Yeah, something like that.
yeah, so I don't think they want to escalate that fight, because then you get the return volley of a Rockstar and a Take-Two, and you don't. It would surprise me if Sony does that. I would say Sony should be scared. Sony should have been scared when they realized Microsoft was moving to a Game Pass recurring service revenue model, and I don't think that they weren't. I mean, scared is sounds pejorative, but I mean they should be paying attention and they should be making plans based around it. And I would have liked to have seen Sony make more significant plans around PlayStation Now or whatever an alternative is, and how they were going to operate in this environment. And I think that Xbox Series X and S have eaten their lunch a little bit. Some of the backwards compatibility stuff, some of the stuff they're doing with their code is really, really impressive. I generally like turning on my Xbox, potentially even a little more than I like turning on my PlayStation. But I would like to see them continue to counter that, hopefully with variety. That's me personally. But even if it's not variety, with big stuff that is event releases, because that's what they're going to become. They're going to be the blockbuster company that makes AAA tentpole releases against just a ridiculous quantity of things over on the other side. Now, I think we're going to have a better feel for whether Microsoft's going to succeed entirely on this. And honestly, I think it is Starfield, where you see what does it move, how upset are PlayStation fans, what occurs there, because you're going to have a Bethesda first-person RPG. And I don't know if that game's any good. That's the joke I have with the Microsoft fans exclusively. It's like, nobody's ever seen that game. How do you have any idea? But if it holds to that Bethesda pedigree, I think you're going to start to see some real movement. Microsoft feels like they have the momentum this generation, and we have to see Sony kind of respond to that.
I totally agree with that. I think Sony's on its heels right now. But yeah, I agree. And I also want to let everyone know, keep an eye on the players that we're talking about being acquired are themselves acquiring other players. EA and Take-Two had a bidding war over Codemasters. They got $400 million more, I think, out of
another company that had a higher
EA
price
than
than
Take-Two.
Insomniac.
So it's fascinating. And Take-Two's been quietly buying a bunch of sports studios and are obviously going to start to try to get into some new verticals. So it's a lot of fun things happening. Also, obviously, Chinese money getting involved. I mean, we didn't bring
Definitely.
up Tencent was one of the reasons that Ubisoft was able to get rid of itself of Vivendi. And people can go read about that because that's how Tencent bought some of Ubisoft. So it's all screwed up out there. But I did want to at least give a little bit of a backroom view about how these things might work and some insight from a bright legal mind like yours, Rick. So I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today. And you're welcome here, obviously, anytime.
Oh, absolutely. Well, as people can tell, my tilt, I'm a corporate lawyer. I wear my biases on my sleeve here. I've been doing M&A for, 17 years now. So, yeah, obviously I feel strongly about it in certain respects. I've seen a lot of people succeed with it and a lot of people, get hurt by it. So it's a matter of specific facts and circumstances, but I'm always happy to talk about it. And God knows this might be one of the most eventful kind of times in the video game industry from a business perspective that we've ever seen. So it's certainly very interesting from my perspective and I think from a lot of people's.
Yeah, mine too. And I totally agree. So thanks again, Rick. Thank you all out there for your love, kindness, and support of Last Stand and Sacred Symbols, Defining Duke, of course, and Knockback as well. We'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye. Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is a product and trademark of Last Stand Media and Colin's Last Stand LLC and is proudly recorded in the USA. The show is conceived by, is written by, and is directed by me, Colin Moriarty. My co-hosts are Chris Raygun Maldonado and Dustin Furman. The show is produced by executive producer Dustin Furman. It's edited by associate producer Ben Smith. All of Last Stand's theme music is by my best friend, Ramon Narvaez. As you know, all of Last Stand shows, including Sacred Symbols, are fan-funded on Patreon at patreon.com/laststandmedia. The following names are at the producer level on Patreon, our highest tier, and we're grateful for your thoughtful and kind contributions to our independent endeavor. Thank you.